The dinner was on a Thursday in November. 22 people at the table. The good china. The particular noise of a family that only fully assembles twice a year. My Aunt Patricia was 3 seats to my left. She had been talking for most of the meal, the way she always talks at family gatherings. As the person who summarizes other people's lives for the room. Who got promoted? Who was struggling? Who the children were becoming? She got to me somewhere between the main course and the dessert, she said. And Lena, well, some things don't change. She smiled when she said it. The way people smile when they are saying something unkind and want the smile to carry the weight of the cruelty so the words don't have to, she said. We always said she was the problem child, didn't we? The table went quiet in a specific way as people decided whether to laugh or not. I set down my fork, and I said, I'd like to ask you something, Aunt Patricia, she said. Of course, I said. Would you like to tell everyone at this table where that story came from? She said. What do you mean? I said. I mean, I'd like to know who wrote it. I reached into the bag on the chair beside me. I put a folder on the table. And the room went very, very quiet. Before I tell you what was in that folder, let me take you back 3 weeks earlier, to a box in my grandmother's spare room. And a name on a label that changed everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Lena. I'm 27 years old. I've been called the problem child for as long as I can remember. Not always out loud. The way it usually worked was quieter than that. A look was exchanged across the table. A pause before my name in a sentence. The specific carefulness of people who have already decided what you are and are managing you accordingly. I want to tell you about my family before I tell you about the folder. Because the folder only means something if you understand the family it was found in. My grandmother, Nana Rose, is 81. She is the kind of woman who has kept every piece of paper that ever passed through her hands. Not from sentiment exactly. From the conviction that things written down are more real than things remembered. She had been a legal secretary for 30 years. She understood what a document was. She understood what it could do. Looking back now, I should have understood earlier that a woman who valued documents would also be the target of someone who understood their power. I didn't understand that until 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. My mother is Janet. She is the younger of 2 sisters. Her older sister is Patricia, Aunt Patricia, who is 61 and has occupied the position of family matriarch since I was small, with the particular authority of someone who mistakes seniority for wisdom. Patricia has always been the one who explained things about other people. Not unkindly, she would say. Out of concern. The way she explained that my cousin Marcus had always had trouble with focus. That my Uncle Ray had never really applied himself. That my mother's first marriage, my father's marriage, had been a mistake from the beginning. Looking back now, Patricia was always the first person to define what had happened before anyone else could offer a different version. I didn't understand then that this was a skill she practiced. I thought she was just the kind of person who talked a lot. I was labeled the problem child when I was 12. I know the exact year because I can trace it back to a specific dinner. Another Thanksgiving, another full table, where I had asked a question nobody wanted to answer. My grandmother had mentioned something about my father's family, his parents, whether they had been in touch. My father had died when I was 9. A car accident, a fact that had been handled the way our family handled difficult facts. Quickly with practicality, and then filed away. I said, "Do Dad's parents ever ask about me?" The table went quiet. Patricia said, "Sweetheart, let's not go into all of that tonight." I said, "I just want to know if they ask about me," she said. Some questions are better left alone. And something happened in the air at that table that I felt but couldn't name. I had asked the wrong question. I had been inconvenienced. I had broken the surface of something everyone else had agreed not to break. Looking back now, that was the moment I became the problem child. Not because I was difficult, because I asked. The label settled over the following years like weather, gradual. Then suddenly, completely present. I was the one who pushed back, the one who didn't let things go. The one who noticed inconsistencies and named them when everyone else had agreed to move past them. My mother would say, "Lena, please. Not tonight." My grandmother would look at her hands, Patricia would smile and say something redirecting, and the conversation would move on. And I would sit there knowing I had seen something real that no one was willing to confirm. Looking back now, every time I was called the problem child, what they really meant was, she is asking a question we don't want to answer. That's different from being a problem. That's being clear-sighted in a room that has chosen not to see. I didn't know how right I was until I opened a box in my grandmother's spare room 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Nana Rose had decided to move. Not far from her house of 30 years to a smaller apartment in the same town. But the house needed to be cleared. 30 years of a legal secretary's accumulated documents, correspondence, and the specific density of a life kept in paper. She asked me to help. I had always been the grandchild she called for practical things. Not because the others weren't available, because I was the one who didn't rush her, who sat with the sorting without making it feel like a task to be completed. We had been at it for 2 weekends, the third weekend. The Saturday 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I was in the spare room, a closet, top shelf. 3 cardboard boxes labeled in her handwriting. Correspondence. Family. I pulled down the second box. Inside, folders. Labeled by name. My mother's folder. My uncle's folder. A folder for Patricia. And a folder with my name on it. Lena, notes. I stood on the step stool with that folder in my hand. I looked at the label for a moment. Then I opened it. And the first thing I read made me sit down on the floor of the spare room and not get up for 20 minutes. The folder contained letters. Not from me. About me. Handwritten letters from Patricia to my grandmother. Spanning 12 years. From the year I was 13 to the year I was 24. 12 years of letters in which my aunt had written in careful detail her assessment of who I was and what she said I had done. I read the first one standing up. By the third one, I had sat down on the spare room floor. By the sixth one, I understood something I had not understood for 15 years. The problem child story had an author, and her name was Patricia. Not every letter was cruel. Some were simply observational. The tone of someone reporting on a subject to a superior. Lena said this at Christmas. Lena behaved this way at the birthday dinner. Lena has been difficult about the visit, but some were specific. There was a letter from when I was 16. Patricia had written, I wanted to let you know about an incident at Janet's. Lena said something about you to her mother that I think you should be aware of. She said you play favorites. That you always have. She had written this as a report. A concerned daughter is writing to protect her mother from a granddaughter who said something hurtful. I had never said that. I had never said anything like that. I had not been aware, at 16, that the slight chill I'd noticed from my grandmother around that time had a cause. Now I knew the cause. It was a letter that I had never seen, that my grandmother had apparently believed. I kept reading. There was a letter from when I was 19. Patricia had written, I'm concerned about Lena's influence on Janet. She's been asking Janet questions about the early years. About David's family. In a way that I think is reopening wounds. Janet won't say anything to Lena because she doesn't want conflict. But I can see it's affecting her. My father's name was David. I'd asked my mother about his family twice since he died. Twice in 10 years. And both times had been described, apparently, as an ongoing pattern of reopening wounds. I turned to the next letter. Then I heard my grandmother's footsteps in the hallway. I put the folder in my bag. I put the box back on the shelf. I went back into the kitchen and helped her sort through a drawer of old warranties. She said, You're quiet today. I said, Just tired. Looking back now, I should have asked her that day. I should have put the folder on her kitchen table and asked her to explain it. I was too shocked to be clear. That was 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had 21 days to decide what to do with what I had found. The first thing I did was call my friend Petra. Petra has known me since college. She is the kind of friend who does not perform reactions. She processes and then she speaks. I read her 3 of the letters over the phone. Verbatim. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Lena, your grandmother received these. I said, Yes, she said, and believe them. I said, there were things in those years where she was cooler toward me. Things I noticed but couldn't explain. Now I can explain them. She said, So Patricia was narrating your life to your grandmother, I said. For 12 years, she said. Does your mother know? I stopped. I said, I don't know, she said. That's the first question, she said. Because either your mother knows, which means she let this happen, or she doesn't know, which means she's also been operating on a version of you that Patricia wrote. I sat with that. Petra said, Lena, which one is worse? I said, I don't know yet, she said. Find out before Thanksgiving. I did. But what I found was not what I expected. I called my mother on a Sunday evening. I did not show her the letters yet. I said, Mom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, she said. Okay, I said. When I was 16. Did something happen between Nana Rose and me? Did they tell you I said something about her? A pause. She said, There was something, yes. Patricia mentioned it. I said, What did she say I did? She said, you told me that Rose played favorites, that you were upset about it. I said, Mom, I never said that. Silence. I said, Not to you. Not to anyone. I never said Nana Rose played favorites, she said. Lena, I said. Did you believe it when Patricia told you? Another pause. Longer, she said. I didn't know what to believe. Patricia said she'd heard it directly. I said. From who? My mother did not answer. Because the answer was, from Patricia. Patricia had told my grandmother I'd said it, and apparently told my mother a version as well. 2 different versions of an incident that had never happened. Feeding different people different amounts of the same story. I said, Mom, I need you to sit with something. She said, okay. I said, I found letters in Nana Rose's spare room. I told her what was in them. My mother was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, I didn't know she was writing to her. I said, every year. For 12 years. She said, Lena. She stopped. She said, some of the things I believed about you when you were a teenager. She stopped again. I said, you can tell me. She said, I believed them because Patricia said them. She was the older one. She was there more. I was working double shifts when you were 15 and 16. I trusted what she told me. She said, I'm so sorry. I said, Mom, I need to ask you something. She said, okay. I said, are you coming to Thanksgiving? She said, yes. I said, so is Patricia. She said, I know. I said, I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do. She said, Lena, whatever you decide. She stopped. She said, I'm on your side. I want you to know that now, before anything happens. That was the first time my mother had said that to me in 27 years. I held the phone after we hung up. And I thought about the specific loneliness of having a parent who was on your side, but didn't know it until you showed them the evidence. I spent 3 weeks with the folder, not in anger, in clarity. I read every letter twice. Then I made notes, not about what hurt, but about what was specific. What could be contradicted? What could be verified? The 16-year-old incident, false. I had not said what Patricia reported. The 19-year-old pattern, exaggerated to the point of fiction. 2 questions about my father's family over 10 years had become an ongoing concerning pattern of behavior. There was a letter from when I was 22 that described an argument between my mother and me at Christmas, Lena being hostile and aggressive toward Janet in front of the family. I remembered that Christmas. I had disagreed with my mother about something minor. Something about a recipe, I think. We had gone back and forth for maybe 3 minutes and then moved on. Hostile and aggressive. Written down. Sent to my grandmother. Filed. I did not call Patricia. I did not warn her. I thought about what I actually wanted, not what I wanted to say. What I wanted to happen. I wanted my grandmother to know the truth. I wanted my mother to stop carrying a version of me that Patricia had written. I wanted to be in a room where the record was corrected, a family dinner. The right one, with everyone present. Was the only room where all of those things could happen at the same time. I made one more call before Thanksgiving. I called my grandmother. I said, Nana, I found something in the spare room when I was helping you pack. She said, what did you find? I said, a folder with my name on it. Letters from Patricia. Silence. She said, I kept those. I said, I know. She said, I kept correspondence because I was a secretary for 30 years. I kept everything. I said, I know. She said, Lena. I said, yes. She said, I believed some things about you that I should have asked you about directly. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry for that. I said, Nana, did you know the things she wrote weren't always accurate? A long pause. She said, I knew Patricia had a way of emphasizing certain things, she said. I think I told myself it was a concern, she said. I should have asked you directly. I said, yes, you should have. I said, I'm going to ask you something, she said. Okay. I said, if Patricia does what she always does at Thanksgiving, if she uses my name as a punchline the way she always has, I'm going to say something in front of everyone. Silence. She said, what will you say? It's the truth. She said, will you show them the letters? I said, if I need to. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, I'll be there on Thursday. She said it the way people say things when they want you to know they'll be standing beside you. That was all I needed. The week before Thanksgiving, Patricia called me on Monday. Not about anything specific. One of her check-in calls. The kind where she manages the relationship by maintaining the appearance of warmth. She said, we're all looking forward to Thursday. It'll be so nice to have everyone together. I said. Yes, she said. Your grandmother mentioned you've been helping her pack. That's so good of you. I said. I found a few interesting things. A brief pause. She said. Oh, like what? I said. Old correspondence, mostly. Letters from different people over the years. Another pause. Shorter than the first, she said. Rose kept everything. You know how she is. I said. Yes, I do, she said. Well, it's wonderful that she has you to help her. She said it with the particular warmth of someone who has just heard something they don't fully understand but has decided not to ask. She did not ask. Looking back now, she almost knew in that moment. She chose not to find out. Which is, I think, what she had always chosen. My boyfriend, Marcus. We had been together for 2 years. Knew most of the story by Wednesday evening. I had told him piece by piece over the 3 weeks to spare the room. He sat at my kitchen table and read 3 of the letters. He said, Lena. I said, yes. He said, she manufactured your reputation inside your own family. I said, yes. He said, for 12 years. I said, yes. He said, what are you going to do tomorrow? I said, I'm going to let her do what she always does. He said, and then, I said, and then I'm going to ask her to explain it. He said, in front of everyone. I said, yes. He said, are you sure? I said, I've been sure for 3 weeks. He said, okay. He said, I'll be right beside you. He said it the way Marcus says things. Without addition, without qualification. Just the statement and its full weight. What do you think happened when Patricia called me the problem child at that dinner? Option A. I stayed quiet and let it land the way it always had. Option B. I responded calmly with a question that opened everything up. Option C. I left the table and came back with the folder. Drop your answer in the comments. Because what happened next? The 3 seconds between when she said it and when I responded is something I rehearsed and then forgot entirely when the moment arrived. Wednesday night. The folder was on my kitchen table. I had organized it before I packed it into my bag. The letters in chronological order. The 3 I had flagged with paper clips. The 16-year-old incident, the 19-year-old pattern, the 22-year-old Christmas argument. The 3 most specific. The 3 most clearly false. I didn't read them again that night. I had them memorized. I sat at the table and thought about my grandmother instead. About what it meant that she had kept the letters. She had kept them in a folder with my name on it. Not thrown away. Not ignored. Filed. A legal secretary for 30 years files things because she might need them. Had some part of her known she might need them. Had some part of her kept them because she wasn't entirely sure. I thought about the specific texture of her apology on the phone. I knew Patricia had a way of emphasizing certain things. She had known. Not fully. Not clearly enough to act on it. But somewhere in the 30 years of filing correspondence, she had known that emphasis was not the same as truth. And she had filed the letters anyway. Looking back now, she had been building a record. Not to use. In case. The tears came quietly. Not from grief exactly. From the particular tiredness of having carried a name. Problem child. For 15 years without knowing where it came from. Not from the truth. From a folder. From a woman who had understood what documents could do and had used that understanding to write a version of me that the family had read and believed. I put the folder in my bag. I set my alarm. I went to bed. And I thought about the one thing I hadn't told anyone yet. Not Petra. Not Marcus. Not my mother. The last letter in the folder. Written 2 months ago. 6 weeks before, Nana Rose had asked me to help her pack. I had not told anyone what that last letter said. Because it changed everything about what I thought I was walking into. Thursday. 22 people at the table. The good china. The noise of a family assembling. The particular warmth of a house where something is about to happen that nobody but me, my grandmother, and my mother knows about. Patricia was 3 seats to my left. She had been talking since before the meal was served. The summary of everyone else's year. Delivered with the authority of a woman who considers herself the family's narrator. My grandmother was at the head of the table. She caught my eye once during the main course. She gave me the smallest nod. That was all. Patricia got to me somewhere between the stuffing and the cranberry sauce. She said. And Lena, well, some things don't change. She smiled. She said. We always said she was the problem child, didn't we? The table went quiet. My cousin across from me looked at his plate. My uncle made a small sound that meant nothing. Marcus put his hand on the table beside mine. Not touching. Just there. I set down my fork. I looked at Patricia. I said, "I'd like to ask you something." She said, "Of course." Her voice is still warm. "Still the narrator," I said. "Would you like to tell everyone at this table where that story came from?" She said. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I said, "The problem child story. I'd like to know who wrote it," she said. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said. "Then let me help you." I reached into the bag on the chair beside me. I put the folder on the table. She looked at it. For the first time in my memory, Patricia did not speak immediately. I said, "These are letters, written by you to my grandmother over 12 years ago, in which you describe, in some detail, incidents involving me that you wanted her to be aware of." I said, "I'd like to read one." She said, "Lena, this isn't the place." I said, "It's exactly the place. You made it the place when you said what you just said." The table was very quiet. I opened the folder to the letter with the first paperclip. I said, "This is from 12 years ago. I was 16. I read it. The incident where I had supposedly told my mother that my grandmother played favorites. I read it clearly. Every word. The careful concern in Patricia's voice. The way she had framed it was as a daughter protecting her mother from a difficult grandchild. When I finished, I looked up. I said, "I never said that. Not to my mother. Not to anyone." Patricia said, "Lena, you may not remember." My mother said. She didn't say it. The table was absolutely still. Patricia said, "Janet." My mother said. I checked. After Lena called me last week, I thought about every conversation we had that year. I went through everything I could remember. She didn't say it. And when I asked you at the time how you knew, you told me you'd heard it from someone who'd been there. You never said who. She said, "There's no one." Was there, Patricia? Patricia did not answer. The table was silent in the way of 22 people choosing whether to exist or not. My grandmother said, "Patricia." One word. From the head of the table. That was all she said. Patricia looked at her. My grandmother said, "I kept those letters because I wasn't sure what to do with them. I kept them because I thought I might need to know one day whether what they said was true or not," she said. "Now I know," Patricia said. Mother. My grandmother said, "I think we should have dessert." In the room. Slowly, carefully, with the specific sound of people making a collective decision to let a thing be said without responding to it. Exhaled. The consequences did not come dramatically. They came the way true things come when they have been said in front of the right people. Quietly, one at a time. Over the following weeks, the first call came from my cousin Rachel. The following Saturday, she said, "Lena, I've been thinking about Thursday since Thursday." I said, "Okay." She said, "I want to tell you something. When we were teenagers, Patricia told me something about you. That you had been cruel to your mother during a hard year. That you had said things that had damaged their relationship." I said, "Yes." She said, "I believed her. And I was cooler toward you because of it. For years." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know. It's okay." She said, "It's not okay, but I appreciate you saying it." She said, "How many people in this family have been given a version of you that Patricia wrote?" I said, "I don't know. I've been thinking about that." She said, "I think it might be most of them." I sat with that. Not with anger. With the specific tiredness of understanding that a single person with access to the family's narrative channels had spent 12 years maintaining a story about me. Not because she hated me. I understood that now. Because I was the one who asked questions. Because I was the one who pushed back. Because I was, as she had called me, the problem child. Which had always meant the one who doesn't accept the story without asking where it came from. And for that, she had written me into a shape that made the asking seem like the problem rather than the answer. My mother called on Sunday. She said, "I've been talking to Patricia." I said, "Okay." She said, "She's not going to call you. Not yet. Maybe not for a while." I said, "Okay." She said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Yes?" She said, "All those years when I said not tonight, Lena, when I asked you to let things go, I was managing what Patricia had told me about you. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's what it was." She said, "I don't know how to apologize for 15 years. I said, "You don't have to do it all at once." She said, "I'm going to try anyway." She said it the way my mother says things she means, without looking for the right phrasing, just the thing itself. The last conversation was with my grandmother, the week after Thanksgiving, her new apartment. "Half the boxes are still unpacked," she said. "I owe you more than an apology." I said, "Nana, you were being managed too." She said, "I'm 81 years old. I should have known better than to let one person's letters be the whole record." She said, "I'm a legal secretary." I know a partial record when I see one, she said. I chose not to see it. I said, why? She was quiet for a moment. She said, because Patricia is my daughter, and it is very hard to see clearly the things you love. She said, that's not an excuse. I said, no. She said, but it's the truth. I said, yes. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said, I want you to know something. You were never a problem. You were the one paying attention, she said. I should have paid attention to that. I went home the week before Christmas, not for an event, not for a gathering. I drove home on a Saturday to have lunch with my mother and my grandmother at my grandmother's new apartment. Just the three of us. The first time we had ever done that. My grandmother had made coffee. Her kitchen was smaller than the old one, but had the same particular quality of a place organized by a person who has thought about how they want things arranged. She had found something while unpacking. A photograph, black and white. 3 women at a table, her mother, her grandmother, a great aunt whose name she could barely remember. She put it on the table between us. She said, I've been thinking about stories, I said. What kind? She said. The stories families tell about their people. How do they get started? Who tells them? She said. My grandmother was told stories about my mother that weren't entirely true. Family politics. Old grievances. Things that became the lens everyone used to see her through. She said. My mother spent her whole life being slightly other in that family. Slightly apart. And she never knew why exactly. And the people who told the stories were long gone before anyone could ask. She said. You found the folder before that could happen to you. I said. Yes. She said. Because you were paying attention. I said, and because you kept the letters. She looked at me. She said. Yes. Because I kept the letters. She said it with the dry precision of a woman who had been a legal secretary for 30 years and understood exactly what she had done and why. I held the photograph for a moment. 3 women at a table. The family that came before. The stories told about them, and by them, made up the family I had grown up in. I put it down. My mother poured more coffee. And we sat in my grandmother's new kitchen on a Saturday afternoon and talked for 3 hours about things we had never said directly. About my father. About the years after he died. About the questions I had asked at dinner when I was 12, and what they had actually meant. No one managed the conversation. No one redirected. No one said. Let's not go into all of that tonight. We went into all of it. That's where the folder finally went. Not on a table at Thanksgiving. There, in my grandmother's kitchen, over 3 hours and 2 pots of coffee. Into the place where true things belong. The conversation. It's December now, my grandmother's apartment. The photograph on her kitchen windowsill. The folder's in my apartment. In a box. Not destroyed. Filed. I kept it because my grandmother kept hers. Because I've learned that some documents need to exist. Not to be used as weapons, but to be available. To be the record when the record is needed. Here is what I understand now that I didn't at 12. The problem child was never a child with a problem. The problem child was the child who asked where the story came from. That is an uncomfortable thing to be inside a family that has agreed not to ask. Not because the asking is wrong. Because the asking threatens the agreement. Patricia spent 12 years writing letters because I was the one person in that family who might eventually find them. Not because she knew I would. Because she understood, somewhere, that I was the type who looked. She was right. I looked. I found. I read every word. And I sat at that dinner table and asked her in front of 22 people to tell me where the story came from. She couldn't. Because the story came from her. And a story whose author cannot explain it in public is a story that has reached the end of its useful life. My mother said to me 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry it took me this long to be on your side out loud. I said, I know. She said, were you on your own side? All those years? I thought about it. I said, yes, I think so. Even when I didn't understand why I kept asking. She said, that's what kept you clear. I said, yes, I think she was right. The problem child asked questions. The questions led to a folder. The folder led to a dinner. The dinner led to a silence that finally meant something. And the silence led to a Saturday afternoon in a new kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and the first real conversation I had ever had with my mother and my grandmother at the same time. That's nothing. That's the whole thing. That's what the asking was always for. Has someone in your family spent years managing the story other people told about you? And did you ever find out where that story came from? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Type folder if this story stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more. I'll see you tomorrow.